We'll now have our keynote speaker, Christopher McDougall, and he is sponsored by our longstanding partner, Position Wealth Advisors, formerly known as UMA Financial Services. Christopher McDougall is the author of the international bestsellers Born to Run, Natural Born Heroes, and Running with Sherman. His career started as a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press covering wars in Rwanda, Angola, and Congo. His love of running later inspired his search for understanding how to run longer and better. This started his book career, where his book, Born to Run, took off to the top of the New York Times bestseller chart and Amazon's 100 books to read in a lifetime. His passion for running and the stories he has shared has influenced the popularity of minimalist shoes, chia seeds, and Pinole. Through these heartening stories, he will share what he has learned in his travels and efforts to continually improve. When not speaking at conferences, riding, or traveling, Christopher spends his time running, swimming, climbing, and bear crawling all over near his home. Please welcome Ogden Surgical keynote speaker, Christopher McDougall.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So I wanted to introduce my friend Kalani, because we're going to try and pull something off today, which may be a fiasco or might be a lot of fun. I'm going to be talking a lot about natural movements and natural forms of therapy through muscular activity. And I thought, why not just kick things off right now by doing the thing that everybody hates at a conference, which is getting up out of your chairs and standing up on your feet. But there's going to be a prize. This is not just for stretching and some kind of exercise. We're going to give away something. You might be aware that I am a big critic of the running shoe industry. I believe that we have created a huge mistake by adding more and more to our shoes, creating imbalances which don't really help. So for the first time, I put my feet where my mouth is, and I've actually gotten involved in creating a running shoe, a minimalist shoe, like this one. And so we're going to give away, I don't know, maybe 2 pairs right now this morning, and we're going to do it through the heads or tails game. Does anybody else know the heads or tails game? Yeah, Kalani's the only person other than me that knows this game. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to flip a coin, and then we're going to grab it, and then you guys choose heads or tails. You can put your hand on your head or on your tail. You just choose. And then we'll reveal the coin. And if it's a heads, then all the heads stay in and all of the butt grabbers take a seat. And we'll keep doing this until we eliminate down to probably around 2 people. Does everyone get it? Sound cool? All right, here we go. So hang on, how are we going to do this? You hold, I'll flip, you reveal, okay? So I'll flip, catch, flop, choose your head or your tail. Kalani will say it is?
Heads.
Heads. All the tails are out, heads are back in.
If you chose heads, stay standing.
Okay, let's go again. Heads or tails, choose. A lot of heads people here, okay. That's okay, it still counts.
Tails.
Heads people are out. Tails are still in. How many times have you grabbed your butt, by the way? I got 6. One time? One time, okay. I feel like it's like a psychological profile going on here, like what body part. We're down to about maybe 15 people, right? Okay. Heads or tails? Choose.
Heads.
Heads it is. Tails, sit down.
We didn't get many with that one.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe like 10 left. Let's go again. Heads or tails? Choose, and it is?
Heads.
Heads. Okay, can we just raise our hands so we can see how many people we have left? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's go again. All right. Heads or tails? You've chosen. It is?
Tails.
Tails. How many do we have left? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's go again. Maybe we'll get down to 3. Heads or tails?
Tails.
You know what? I'm surprised. I really thought you were going to win. You were like killing it every time. How many people do we have left? Hands up. 1, 2, our 2 winners. Is there another one? 3 winners there. Come on up. If you guys don't mind, come on up. Come on up. Our friend Kalani will take your name, contact information, and your shoe size. And this is not really a marketing promotion so much as an opportunity for me to say, I finally put my cards on the table, and rather than sit there sniping from the sidelines, telling everyone what they're doing wrong about running shoes, I decided to actually kind of risk my own reputation and decide what I think is right about a running shoe. So these are Zero shoes. It's a Born to Run shoe. And what I like about them is hopefully you'll find a lot of natural movement in them. So you can check in with your 3 colleagues later on and see if they like them when they get them in the mail in a little bit. So there you go, the Zero Shoes Born to Run shoe. I had a certain amount of trepidation coming to address you today because, do you guys still do this thing here at the conference where you talk about what's new in your specialty? Okay. I was reading up on the conference. When I saw that, I had this kind of like pang, this spasm of self-recognition, realizing I have no idea what's new in any of your specialties. I am emphatically not a doctor. I am not a scientist at all. I still think my last science class in college, they're still typing the minus after the D that I got 30 years later. I'm more of a storyteller. I'm more curious than I am investigative. And for that reason, I decided to be very careful about what I'm going to do today. Usually, I like to talk spontaneously off the cuff. But today, if you'll bear with me, I've actually prepared notes that I'm going to read from because I want to make sure I get things right. I was thinking about this on my way in today. Hang on a second. Okay. I was thinking about this on my way in today, that what I like about the idea of doing what's new in your specialty is that it's peer-to-peer, it's student-to-student. It's people learning from each other, but those people have a certain foundation of shared knowledge. And in me, again, I'm not that person. And it reminded me of early in the pandemic when I was talking to one of my neighbors, and he's offering me advice on how to deal with COVID. And he said, I've done a lot of research in epidemiology, which kind of surprised me because I was pretty sure he was a veterinarian. Was a veterinarian. He was a retired veterinarian. And yet he's offering me expert opinions on a life-threatening disease. And it sort of opened my eyes to the fact that that's one of the real dangers that I believe people face today, is that now more than ever, we have a lot of people, thanks to the internet, who are instantly posing as like instant virologists, instant experts in things that are way outside their field of knowledge. So I can promise you today, I am not going to offer you anything new in any of your specialties. What interests me is things that are old, things that keep reappearing again and again throughout history. Because if something disappears, it keeps reemerging on its own spontaneously, it lends me to believe that there's something there. There's some reason why human behavior keeps seeking out these forms of natural therapies or treatments. So one example is ice-cold plunges. Are you guys all familiar with ice-cold plunges? It's become very trendy lately. Joe Rogan and Tony Robbins, Will Smith, these are all like ice bath guys. And coincidentally, so is my neighbor, the retired veterinarian's son-in-law. And I only know this guy, I barely know this guy. I've only seen him once before. We can call him Joe, because his name is Joe. And I met this guy once, like 2 years ago, and then he came back to town for his wedding. And so I went up to him and I congratulated him and said, "Hey, Joe, congratulations. How are things going?" "Great. Things are going great." I said, "Really, dude? Like, no stress?" "No way. Every morning, ice cold plunge. 15-minute ice cold plunge," which automatically would have just enough for me to go, well, forget ice cold plunges. Now endorsed by Joe, forget it. But here's the thing about these ice cold plunges is that, again, they keep reappearing throughout history. The ancient Greeks used to do ice cold ocean plunges. Romans, the same thing. Scandinavians, of course, do ice cold plunges after steam baths. In the UK, in London, they still do open water pond swims deep into winter. In Manhattan, you still have Eastern European traditional neighborhoods which still have the saunas and the ice baths. So for some reason, this is not like a one-off trend discovered by like Gwyneth Paltrow. This is a human behavior that turns up again and again for thousands of years. Those are the kind of things that get my wheels turning and makes me wonder, okay, what is there that we can extract? What can we find that is of use today? And nothing got my interest more piqued than hearing about the resistance, the civilian resistance in Greece during World War II. And not just all of Greece, but specifically the Greek island of Crete. This is a tiny island in the Mediterranean, and it is the only place on Earth where the civilian resistance began the day the Germans arrived. Every other place, Germany would roll into France, Belgium, Holland, and after the standing army was defeated, months later, a civilian resistance would begin to emerge. On Crete, these guys were grabbing pitchforks while the paratroopers were still in the air. They're coming down, and these guys are grabbing weapons and running out into the streets. And it got me wondering about three things. Again, these are civilians. These are not soldiers. These are people like in this room who were under attack and had three things going on for them. Physically, they had the capability to actually fight. Mentally, they knew what they were doing and how to organize and band together. And third, I think most important was they had the unity of purpose where they all decided simultaneously to do the same thing. Now, I would predict that if Nazi paratroopers were coming down on us right now, we would not all do the same thing at the same time. There would be a lot of different reactions to an attack by German paratroopers in this room, let alone an entire island nation. So that got me wondering, what did the Cretans know that the rest of us didn't? We saw it during the pandemic, how many people reacted very, very differently. How many people took a national emergency and turned it to their own purposes rather than the purposes of each other. So I became intrigued by what was going on in Crete during World War II. To me, it was a great social experiment in those three aspects. Physically, what did they know? Mentally, what did they know? And most of all, spiritually, in terms of their own identity, how do they identify in a way that led them all to pushing the same wheel in the same direction as opposed to pushing and pulling against each other? And what I discovered was something I found really interesting, which is that in Crete and in ancient Greece, there was a thing known as the art of the hero. And the art of the hero was this sense that you are responsible for everyone else around you. Not just yourself, not just your family, everyone. And there was a certain practical purpose in the art of the hero, which was that back in ancient Greece, you didn't have a standing police force, you didn't have a fire department, you didn't have physicians, you didn't have a standing army. You only had your neighbors, period. So if your house is on fire, you're counting on the ex-veterinarian to run over and help you put it out. If someone is robbing your house, you can't call the police. You've got to deal with this guy yourself. If you're attacked by the Italians, you got to form instantly into a standing army to repel the invaders. And for that reason, what the ancient Greeks did was educate everyone from the time they were little in all three aspects. Now, we've kind of perverted the notion of hero into this, kind of Hollywood version of Schwarzenegger and, The Rock, overly muscled, super powerful, ass kicker, usually with a firearm. Well, in ancient Greece, there were no firearms. And you did not want to be this overly sized, over-muscled creature because you're pretty much useless to anybody else. When you think about it, honestly, if you're drowning, do you want The Rock coming after you? The least capable guy in the water is going to be the guy that's loaded up on steroids and muscle enhancers. You want somebody who is physically capable, mentally capable, and also is thinking about you and not him. So that's why the Greeks created this ancient art of the hero. And it got so much to the point where the term for citizen was basically that. On Crete, the specific word for a citizen was emerodromoi. And emerodromoi meant long-distance runner, someone who could run a long distance. And one reason why was because in the Cretan settlements, they had their own version of neighborhood watch, where the adults, men and women alike, would trot around the circumference of the village in the evening and just keep an eye on things. And it became like a nightly ritual. And you see it today in some European cities where everyone does what they call the promenade. People go out and walk up and down the streets. It's believed it's a social thing, it's a showing off thing, but it's actually an ancient European tradition of basically being your own night watch patrol. You go out, you walk your streets, you're chatting with your neighbors, but the idea is you're also keeping an eye on what's going on. You have to be physically capable of doing this. You have to be mentally alert enough to notice differences when things are going wrong, and you have to want to do it. You have to feel as connected to your neighbor as you hope they feel to you, so that there's that drive to not just sit inside and watch TV, but to get out and physically move yourself and be as responsible for your neighbors as they are for you. I'm going to refer to my notes now, make sure I'm still on target. Okay, so we are talking about the Greek resistance on World War II. So here's the scene. At this point, Germany has just blasted through the rest of Europe. They've just knifed through Poland, through France. They are threatening England. If you've seen the film Dunkirk, you know about that unbelievable evacuation of the British troops from the shores of France. Britain was on the ropes, like the greatest power in Europe that could stand up to the German advance. England was on the verge of being toppled. Every major European power was blasted, and all that Germany had to do now to win the war was defeat Russia. That was it. That was the only thing standing in their way. The U.S. was on the sidelines. This was not their fight. We had not entered the fight. We had no interest in entering the fight. The only European power that could stand up to Germany at this point was Russia. So what the Germans decided to do was they're going to turn their attention away from the UK at this point because they're on the ropes. They're going to topple anyway. They'll circle back and get them later. Now they're going to turn their attention on Eastern Europe. And they set up the Greek island of Crete as a way station. It was kind of like a big arsenal warehouse. It's a place they could store weapons and troops, which could get their soldiers into Eastern Europe and into Africa. They could get oil and minerals out of Africa, which they needed for their weapons, and they could launch their manpower into Russia. So Crete was this big jumping off spot for German soldiers. All that they had to do was just kind of lock it down, which would have been easy because, again, Crete had no standing army. So the Germans decided, we'll go in 24 hours, we'll lock down this island, we'll move a lot of our manpower in there, we'll ship a lot of our oil there as a depot, and from that, we can use Crete as our jumping off spot into Russia. They gave themselves 24 hours to lock it down. 3 months later, the German soldiers are still fighting the dentists and the bookkeepers who are running around with their pitchforks. Later on, at the Nuremberg trials, they brought German generals up, and they would say over and over again, the reason we lost the war was not because of Normandy, it was not because of the U.S., it's because of those goddamn Cretans. The Cretan resistance held Germany up for 3 crucial months. And because of those 3 months, Germany did not arrive in Russia as planned in the spring. They arrived in the fall. And the fall is a terrible time to arrive in Russia because that is when you have the fall rains followed by the winter freeze. It rains a ton, which turns all the roads into mud, and then everything freezes up and turns to snow. And because Germany arrived in Russia in October as opposed to May, they got hit by the worst weather they could, which ultimately slowed them up and made the invasion impossible. So it's one of those quirks of history that may or may not be true, but it is, to me, interesting that the Germans themselves pointed to Crete as the critical turning point in the war, the one place that had no army and only had citizens to count on. So I became more and more intrigued by this art of the hero. It's a question that another guy was asking himself too. There's a guy named Georges Hébert. Georges Hébert was a French naval officer, 27 years old, back in the early 1900s. And he was kind of asking himself the same question I was, like, what is this art of the hero? Like, what is it that will allow all of us to be as physically, mentally, and spiritually capable of solving not only our own problems, but each other's? So I'm just going to read you a little passage that I have from Natural Born Heroes because I feel like I got it right there, and try to improvise it now would be a mistake. So let me get this right. It's a pretty cool story, if I can pull it. Here we go. So here we have this guy named Georges Hébert. It's 1902. He is on this French naval warship off the island of Martinique. And he's about to confront a situation very similar to the Cretans when the Germans would later invade. Here's what happened. During the first week of May 1902, Georges Hébert was stationed on the warship Souchet off the coast of Martinique, known as the Paris of the Caribbean. For days, Martinique's Mount Pelée had been spraying up bursts of sparks, but no one was really concerned. The volcano had been dormant for more than a century. But 2 days later, pent-up gases tore the top off the mountain. 2 explosions boomed, one 7 miles straight up in the air, the other a cannon of burning gas and fiery rock pointed straight at the capital, Saint-Pierre. Lava gushed down the slope, launching swarms of fleeing vipers and crazed animals. People ran from their homes only to be pelted by red-hot boulders, choked by ash and smoke, and slashed by these venomous snakes. Into this nightmare plunged Georges Hébert. He and his fellow naval officers tried to approach the port on a rescue mission, but the blistering heat and furious winds churned the sea and threatened to crash the ship into the rocks. Hébert helped lower a launch and set off with a small band of fellow sailors. While everyone else in Saint-Pierre was running away from the horror, Georges Hébert and his crew were fighting their way into it. They'd be among the very few who looked straight at the nightmare and lived to remember. For hours, Hébert and his crew fought to stay afloat while pulling scorched survivors from the water and rowing them to safety on the Souchet. More than 30,000 people were in the city. More than 29,000 died. One of the greatest calamities in history has fallen upon our neighboring island of Martinique, President Theodore Roosevelt would lament. But beyond the body count, the tragedy had a morbid fascination. How much mourning do people need to outrun a volcano? Have our survival instincts decayed so badly that even when fire flares into the sky, we don't pay attention? But one question in particular needled Georges Hébert. How many people were betrayed by their own bodies? They weren't killed. They died frozen and uncertain when they could have been running, crawling, jumping, or swimming for their lives. The only survivors, according to one European commentator at the time, were the natives who were saved by their own strength and skill. According to this European commentator, they were descendants of the savages that inhabited the archipelago long before the whites or blacks arrived, he wrote. Some unconscious or atavistic wisdom had prompted them to escape. These primitive men had an inborn knack of survival when dealing with their ancestral problems, which was lacking in everyone else. Again, forgive the archaic language about savages, etc., but his idea was that it wasn't the settlers who knew how to survive on this island. It was people who lived there forever. They were tapping into an ancestral knowledge that everyone else, newcomers to the island, were unaware of. Their inborn knack was really nothing special. It was just the same familiarity with their bodies and the natural world that humans have relied on for most of our existence. They are what Homer had in mind when he created Odysseus, his ultimate unsinkable hero. Not super strong, just smart and sinewy enough to adapt to any circumstance. Once the heaving sea has shaken my raft to pieces, Odysseus declares, then I will swim. So can that innate knack be reborn? Georges Hébert chewed the problem over during his journey back to France. He was greeted as a hero, but he felt that his real rescue operation had yet to begin. Georges Hébert realized that we've lulled ourselves into believing that in an emergency, someone else will always come along to rescue us. We've stopped relying on our own wonderfully adaptable bodies. We've forgotten that we can think, climb, leap, run, throw, swim, and fight with more versatility than any other creature on the planet. But how many of his fellow Parisians, Georges Hébert wondered, could pull themselves up on a ledge, or leap across a 3-foot chasm, or carry a child to safety. Even could he. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen any grown-up crawl, climb a tree, somersault to cushion a blow, or even sprint. So George Hebert had to wonder, what went wrong? Why do we turn our backs on this tradition of strength and allow ourselves to become so helpless? Let's see. I was going to skip that part. What he believed you're aiming for is the hero's holy trinity, paideia, arete, and xenia, skill, strength, and desire, mind, body, and spirit. The reason why the third one is important was because George Hebert believed that if you exercise only with the intention to carry out a physical gain or to triumph over competitors, you are being brutally egotistic. Brutally egotistic, which I feel is such an orientating word for us these days. Brutally egotistic. This idea of, it's for me, about me first, everyone else second. And his idea was the opposite. You know, sports, recreation, exercise should not be about competition, which is all we hear about today. It should not be about spectating, watching somebody else do something we feel we can't do. That is brutally egotistic in the sense that we're valuing somebody else's performance for our entertainment over our own participation. To try something and be bad about it is the opposite of being brutally egotistic. To try something just for the sheer educational aspect of it, for the learning, for the contribution aspect, is what Hebert was all about. But to say, well, okay, they're better than me, I'm just going to sit back and watch the NFL, as opposed to going out in the backyard and chucking a ball around, that's brutally egotistic. And brutal egotism, Hebert believed, just isn't human. We like to think of ourselves as masters of our own destinies, as lone wolves in a dog-eat-dog world. But guess what? Dogs don't eat dogs. They work together, as do most species, as do we. In fact, when it comes to wolf pack tactics, humans are even better than wolves. We're the most communicative, helpful species that's ever existed. If anything, we overshare. We are very happy to tell people how to do everything. We share every idea, every tool, every belief. So, Hebert argued, forget brutal egotism. That's not our real strength. The single greatest moment of his own life came when he plunged into that little boat, into the cauldron off Martinique, and began pulling burned, frightened survivors into his own arms. Consequently, George Hebert came up with the strangest mission statement ever devised for getting in shape. He called it the natural method, and it would be ruled by a 5-word credo that had zero to do with getting ripped, getting thin, or going for the gold. In fact, it had zero to do with getting anything. George Hebert was heading in the opposite direction. Be fit to be useful. It was kind of brilliant because in those final 2 words, George Hebert came up with a complete philosophy of life. No matter who you are, no matter what you're seeking or hope to leave behind after your time on the planet, is there any better approach than simply to be useful? Here is the great duty of man to himself, to his family, to his homeland, and to humanity, George Hebert would write. Only the strong will prove useful in difficult circumstances of life. So now that he had his mission statement, George Hebert needed a method. Luckily, he had the perfect case study right under his feet, his own kids. When his children were playing, he realized they're really role-playing disaster scenarios. You turn kids loose, and what do? They run, they wrestle, they hide, they roll around, they kick fight with their feet, they leap off of anything they can climb. How many times have you looked at a kid and told them, stop, don't do that, be careful, be careful? But what they're doing is sort of testing those boundaries of what their bodies are naturally capable of absorbing and adapting to. Natural training should spring from nature, George Hebert decided, so kids' play would be his starting point. It didn't take him long to realize that most roughhousing is a selection of 10 basic natural movements. You walk, you run, you crawl. You climb, you balance, you jump, you swim, you throw, you lift, you fight. 10 natural movements. I'll repeat them again. Walk, run, crawl, climb, balance, jump, swim, throw, lift, and fight. Okay, they sound super basic. Again, you've seen them on any playground, but you have to ask yourselves, well, when was the last time I did any of those things? And even if you are a super universal athlete, let's say you're an Ironman triathlete, well, basically you ride a bike, you swim, and you run. You're not lifting anything, you're not throwing anything, you're not climbing anything. And what George Hebert wanted to do was figure out, well, why don't we do any of this kind of stuff before? And it's a question that somebody else was asking at the same time, which was Theodore Roosevelt. Because Theodore Roosevelt was, again, a perfect case study. He was a guy that had been physically sick and had difficulty with his body and had to train himself into shape. And when he was looking for someone to coach him as a young man, he settled on a fighter. He hired a boxer to teach him how to get into shape. And the reason why was he decided, the one athlete that has no margin for error is a fighter. If a fighter makes a mistake, a fighter is going to get his head knocked off. A fighter has got to be able to think, to move, to adapt to any kind of circumstances. Teddy Roosevelt put him through a kind of a training regime that was based on physical combat. The idea, though, was that in physical combat, you are adapting your body to a complete range of motion, up, down, side to side, back, forth, fast, and slow. Those were the kind of gyms that used to dominate around the world for a long time. Fighter-style gyms were the only kind of gymnasiums that existed. And then something happened in the 1970s, which I believe kind of put us in the situation we're in today, which is we took something which had been designed for maximum natural movement, and we turned it into something designed for natural marketing. It's my same problem I have with the running shoe industry, because it's kind of interesting. I actually grew up through the running shoe industry. I was a kid in the early 1970s when my dad, a former Marine, decided to get back into shape, and he decided to start running. And the way he did it was by pulling on the only sneakers he had, the only sneakers that anybody had, which was a pair of those black Converse All-Star lace-ups. And he put on those shoes, and he went running in those shoes. And that's what he did for years. And for every year, he used to run 2 marathons a year, every year, in his black lace-up Chuckies. But then over time, the running shoe industry really started to gin up in the 1970s and the 80s, and his running shoes began to change. And all of a sudden, he started to get these injuries he never had before. And so he kept changing the shoes and changing the shoes, and he never outstripped the injuries. And then finally, there was like that revelation. He's like, maybe I should go back to the Chuckies. And so at age 62, he gets rid of his Asics, and he buys himself a pair of black lace-up Chuckies. And the one thing he realized is, oh, hey, there's no arch support in this shoe. Oh, there's no cushion heel in this shoe. And it's really kind of floppy on my foot. My foot's moving around in my shoe. He starts wearing the Chuckies, and suddenly the heel pain he had disappeared, the lower back pain he had disappeared, the Achilles strains he had disappeared. So again, this is just one anecdotal case study, but it got my own wheels turning in my mind of how come this shoe that's been around for 70 years is performing way better on a 62-year-old man than the most state-of-the-art, cushioned, structured shoe that he's able to buy. I think the reason why is because in the sense of marketing, if there's not something you can add to the situation, you've got nothing to sell. And that's what happened with the gymnasium culture, the whole entire exercise industry. If you got nothing to add to the situation, you got nothing to sell. So whether we need it or not, we keep adding something. And it reached its pinnacle in the 1970s when, I got to pull up his name because I don't remember, but the guy who created the Nautilus machine rolls out his first machine. This was a major innovation in, this was, hang on, here we go. I just got to pull up his name because this guy was pretty cool. Here we go. Okay. No, it's Arnold. Hang on. Arthur Jones. Okay. So you had the Teddy Roosevelt model of the gymnasium, a big open space where you would have like kettlebells and those Indian clubs. You do push-ups and pull-ups and you work out in the rings. There's a kind of thing they did called the ring fight, where each person would hold a ring in each hand, and then their opponent would grab the other side of the rings, and you pull these things back and forth and fight across the room, trying to pull the other person off their feet. Now, an exercise like that, where two people are each grabbing a ring in each hand and trying to pull themselves off their feet, imagine doing that in a normal gym today. You know, with all the machinery, all the people around, you can never do it. You need a lot of space for these two ding-dongs to be, you know, fighting around and wrestling back and forth. But those are the gyms of the past. The problem with a gym like that, though, however, is you can't get a lot of people in there because it takes up a lot of space. So this guy named Arthur Jones, in the early 1970s, he was a chain-smoking high school dropout turned big game hunter whose hobby was trying to overfeed his 14-foot alligator to be big enough to set a Guinness World Record. He was also a self-taught mechanic who built an exercise machine he called the Blue Monster. Arthur Jones' brainstorm was a special kidney-shaped cam that distributed resistance as the weight was pushed higher. Because the gear also resembled a seashell, he renamed his creation the Nautilus. Now, finally, gym owners could offer one thing that your basement bench press couldn't: a specialty machine that made you feel like a pro. The Nautilus was compact and quiet and safe, allowing gyms to herd many more customers through much less space. Even during the New Year's Eve rush, or the New Year's rush, you didn't have to worry about members smacking one another with medicine balls or turning the joint into a full combat mosh pit as they careened around with strength rings and Indian clubs. There were no dumbbells to rack or techniques to teach. No spotters were even required for the bench press. Expertise wasn't required. All you had to do was look pretty, take money, and wipe down the equipment. The idea of a health club really changed. It became big business. It was Arthur Jones that started that, one of his designers would later tell the New York Times. Mr. Jones' invention led to the machine age environment that is prevalent today in health clubs. The machines helped transform dank gyms filled with free weights and hulking men into fashionable fitness clubs popular with recreational athletes. Which sounds great. You get a lot more people into the gym, but it's kind of poor because what is now teaching is rather than full range of motion, you get people who are focused on two things and two things only: number of reps and size of your body. Number of reps and size of your body. Not range of motion, not expertise, not unity of purpose, but brutal egotism, repetitions, and size of your body. It's the thing that I think has fundamentally taken us in this downward spiral and drawn us further and further away from what should be, I think, the unifying purpose of what exercise really should be. But let me circle back before I get to that conclusion and tell you what happened on the Greek island of Crete. So during World War II, we have the resistance. We have these citizens trying to figure out for themselves, how do you stand up to the most formidable fighting force in history? And so they came up with a plan. Their plan was, look, we will never have enough manpower and weapons to defeat the Germans on our own. We got to come up with a Hail Mary pass. So they came up with this plan. Rather than going toe-to-toe with Hitler's forces, let's sneak around behind them, capture the general, take him off the island, and leave the soldiers, the German soldiers, without their leader. That was their plan, which is a stupid plan. No one has ever tried to capture the commanding officer from behind enemy lines for a very good reason. It's impossible, you know? You have thousands of soldiers in front of you, and somehow you're going to sneak behind them, get the most protected person in that force, and then go back through the same soldiers that you just snuck through in the first place without anybody noticing. And then, remember, you're on an island. There's nowhere to go. It's a very tiny island. I have hiked back and forth across this island myself 4 times. It's really small. So now you got the guy, you're running around, you got no Air Force, you got no planes. The Germans have 110,000 soldiers looking for you. The island is ringed by German warships. It is buzzed by search planes, and you're running around with a guy who's pretty pissed off about the whole thing and is not being the most cooperative kidnapping victim. The Cretans decide to go ahead with it anyway, and they pull it off. Not only do they somehow sneak behind the German defenses, not only do they grab the general against his will and get back through the defenses, but then they go on the run for 47 days. For 47 days, They are the most wanted people on planet Earth, hiding on an island, running around, living off the land, because again, there's not like they're popping into the supermarket and grabbing some ramen. They are living off of what they can find while they're on the run. They are hiding, they're climbing, they are scaling through mountains, they're hiding in caves, and eventually they are swimming out to sea to put the general onto a fishing boat and get him off into Allied custody in a POW camp in Egypt. That was basically the story to me of Natural Born Heroes. That was the mystery I wanted to solve, which was physically how they pull it off. What did they eat? How did they train? And most of all, how did they decide together that this was going to be their unified mission? And where it led me on, though, was it was, to me, a much more relevant and practical question for all of us today. Like, how can we change what we're doing? Because you, as medical people, I think you're faced with a really difficult problem, which is that you're constantly being called in to repair the damage. And like, how much better would your lives be if you could fend it off beforehand? I'm sure you guys face this question all the time, and the word that must drive you the craziest is the word just, right? Like, people always say, well, why don't they just exercise? Why don't they just eat better? Like it's so easy. But I'm sure you confront it all the time. If the people you work with who come to see you had only taken some preventative measures in the first place, how much easier would the problem be down the line to fix the self-caused damage? And I think, hopefully, that there is a lesson there, this idea of the art of the hero. The idea that if we had one shining example, that maybe we could sort of spread the message. And it actually happened once in our own recent history. John F. Kennedy had this idea, like Teddy Roosevelt, that physical fitness had gone awry. So he set up this 50-mile challenge. He was going to have every single person in the armed forces hike 50 miles in 24 hours. And at first, all the military commanders protested, said, no, it's impossible. We're a mobile force. We ride in jeeps and trucks and tanks. We don't kind of move that way on foot. And then while they're having this argument, JFK's younger brother, Robert Kennedy, just went out and did it. He just went out and hiked 50 miles really fast, and he did it in like 22 hours. And it was like an argument over. And it created the JFK challenge, and it spread nationwide. For this brief kind of shining moment, schools and Girl Scout troops and local book clubs and things were all setting out to do their own 50-mile challenge. It's a wonderful example of how one person can spark a movement, this idea of unity of purpose, physical ability, and mental skill. And that's kind of where we are today. I wish I had that kind of quick, easy answer that JFK had about how we can send this through the country. But to me, our starting point at least is understanding that one thing. It's unity of purpose, it's physical capability, and it is the sharing of what we know with each other. That's where I left it with Natural Born Heroes, this idea that if we can rediscover something that has been prevalent throughout history, then maybe we're on to something that is addition by subtraction, by taking something that is very simple and using that as our starting point. Thank you, guys. I know that was a very wandering story. I hope it had some kind of coherence. I appreciate your attention, and particularly for the heads and tails game. And if you have a moment, I'd be happy to take any of your questions. Thanks very much. Are there any questions at all? I know you've got a forum of opportunities to ask them from. Yes, someone in the back. Oh, yeah. Sure, I can repeat it, though. So the young lady was asking about my journalism background. Yeah, it's funny because I've become identified as someone who's like a really good runner. People think I'm a really good runner because they associate me with Born to Run. And I keep trying to set the record straight, like I'm actually a pretty crappy runner. Always had been, and I think if I were a good runner, I probably never would have written Born to Run. I wrote it out of a position of curiosity. So my journalism background was I was a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press. I worked overseas in Portugal, Spain, and Africa for a number of years, rotated back to the United States, and got into magazine writing. And while I was in Mexico on an assignment for the New York Times Magazine, I was supposed to be looking for this missing pop star who was secretly running some brainwashing sex cult, True story, very weird. And while I was there, I heard about this tribe called the Tarahumara who ran these long distances. And I was curious, like, well, why are these guys running 200 miles at age 80 in homemade sandals? And we're all told that running is bad for the body and it'll destroy your knees and, it'll create arthritis. Well, how come these guys are getting away with it and we're not? And that's what led me to write Born to Run. I wrote it from a position of curiosity. And that became sort of my method ever since, is like, if I know very little about the subject, like, that's a good entry point. Right now, I'm writing a book about body surfing. I thought I knew what body surfing was. I came to Hawaii and realized I got no idea what body surfing is. I'm a really bad body surfer, and I got the scars to prove it. And that, to me, that's kind of my career as a journalist, is finding something that seems simple and might be more complicated than we realize. Are there some more questions? I will leave you one thought, too. So when I was writing Natural Born Heroes, one of the questions I had was, how are these things adaptable in our own lives? And what I found is that certain things, diet, exercise, and unity, are actually, there are examples of them around us today, too. So I always feel like if you're looking for that kind of advice, find something that has long lineage and long roots as opposed to something that's just turned up recently. Is there another question?
Do you have any kind of an exercise protocol that uses those 10 types of movement that you gave us?
Yeah, exercise protocol. So here's a fascinating thing. Are you all familiar with parkour? Are you a parkour person, practitioner? Yeah. So parkour, if you Google it, you'll probably be horrified, because most videos of parkour are like 14-year-old ding-dongs like doing backflips off the back of their cars and stuff. On YouTube, it is super like acrobatic and like urban daredeviltry. But parkour is really, basically, it sprang from Georges Hebert's natural movement. There's a direct lineage from Georges Hebert into the modern art of parkour. And that's basically what parkour is today. It's considered like urban gymnastics. Teddy Roosevelt had his own form of parkour. He would leave the White House and pick a spot on the horizon and go, okay, I'm going there. And then he would do a straight line from the White House to wherever that spot was. And whatever was in his way, he would just deal with it. So if he had to climb up a cliff, he'd climb the cliff. And if the Potomac was in the way, he swam across the Potomac. And if he had to wiggle through bushes, he would wiggle through bushes. He would do this at night with a little armed group of military soldiers accompanying him. And he would go out at night and do this in the darkness, and then they would have horses meet them at the ending point, and he'd ride back to the White House before the sun came up. But the idea is that you adapt your body to whatever natural physical challenge is in the way. So if you ask about an exercise movement, parkour is fantastic, because the idea is just based on running, jumping, climbing. But the number one rule of parkour is no competition. If you compete, then you're not worried about what you're doing, you're worried about what the other guy's doing. And so parkour, it's the reason why you probably haven't seen about it, because CrossFit has the CrossFit Games, and every other sport has its championships and its gold medals. Parkour is all about refining the artistry and the art. And so the only problem, though, is that there aren't that many parkour troops around. It's hard to find people who can teach you. If you can find a parkour troop, they're fantastic. But other little things, for instance, like ultimate frisbee, running, jumping, leaping, falling to the ground, things that involve as wide a range of motion as possible, that's your starting point for a good physical exercise one. If you want to go to super small scale, then trail running. Get out on a trail, because the thing about trail running is you can't do it badly and not fall on your face. If you are trying to be super competitive, if you are worried about going as fast as you can, at some point you will break your nose. So if you're out on a trail, you're going to be going up and down, around corners, ducking underneath things, jumping over trees and roots and logs. So in descending order, parkour if you can find it, ultimate frisbee if you can't, and as a worst case scenario, head up into the Wasatches and run some trails. Any other questions? No? Thank you all very much for your attention. I appreciate it. Thank you.